It is February 10th, 1967. Inside the vast space of EMI's Studio 2 is a scene like something straight out of Alice in Wonderland. A mass of colorfully adorned individuals float about the studio, the pantheon of British pop stardom, leading figures of the psychedelic movement, and of course, the Beatles. In the center of the room sits an orchestra, and not just any orchestra, but some of the most esteemed classical musicians in Britain. And as they rehearse, the Beatles greet them, handing them bald caps, clown wigs, rubber noses, gorilla paws, and clip-on nipples. It is a bizarre, spectacular sight. Slowly but surely, the crowd disperses, and the studio grows quiet. The Beatles' producer, George Martin, takes a deep breath, and then counts the musicians in. The sound is strange, a controlled cacophony, at first just quietly stirring, but slowly it begins to build, filling the space, an anxious, almost frightening sound that grows louder and 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 louder until as the end of January neared, Brian Epstein was subjected to continual pressure from the Beatles' record company, EMI, to release a new single. It had been around 5 months since Revolver had released, and that the Beatles had decided to quit touring, as clearly demonstrated by the flurry of newspaper rumors of their dissolution. The general public, and the higher-ups as well, were all anxiously awaiting the Beatles' next move. So Brian Epstein consulted with George Martin, who told Brian that the Beatles had 2 songs just about ready, 2 songs that he considered the best they had made yet. Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. So that part was all good and well. The next step was to shoot some promotional film for the songs, something the Beatles had done before, starting in 1965. The boys were filmed miming to 4 different songs: I Feel Fine, Ticket to Ride, Day Tripper, and We Can Work It Out. Then, in 1966, the Beatles filmed with a familiar name, that being Michael Lindsay Hogg, who would go on to direct the Let It Be documentary. These again were simple films, composed entirely of the Beatles miming to the songs, although Paperback Writer was at least more visually interesting, being filmed in the garden of the historic Chiswick House, rather than studios like all the others. But the promotional films for Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane were to be an entirely different breed, composed not of simple miming, but of dynamic imagery. And this unique pivot was of course prompted by the Beatles themselves, full to the brim with creative innovation, right? Well, surprisingly, no. Time for a quick flashback. Top of the Pops was a BBC program that began in 1964 and, simply put, was a showcase of the most popular music any given week. The band or artist would be invited into the studio to perform the song, and, almost always, they would mime. But why? First off, the television studio was not created to accommodate live music, or at the very least, was not ideal for it. Secondly, why risk a televised blunder or mistake when you can simply mime along? It was just a promotional tool, after all. Well, some people took issue with this. The majority of working musicians made their money off of live performances or working as hired session musicians, 2 positions that had their value diminished by these pseudo-performances. The Musicians' Union came together and decided that mimed performances would be banned. Brian Epstein phoned Swedish director Peter Goldman for the job, and he promptly flew into the UK. My first meeting with the group was at Ringo's house. He was very kind and took me for a walk in his garden with his wife Maureen and their little white poodle, Tiger. I got my boots all muddy, and Ringo insisted on giving me another pair to replace them. That is really typical of him. I was amazed to find that there was a ban in Britain which prevented the Beatles from miming to their record. So I had to find settings and ideas which were sympathetic to their songs without turning them into comic actors. On January 30th, they began filming on the grounds of the historic Knoll House, picked specifically due to the dead oak tree that resided there. The strange fantasy instrument hung up in the tree was the idea of Klaus Voormann, longtime friend to the Beatles, and the artist behind the Revolver album cover. They took a piano and tore it apart, reconfiguring it into what we see in the film. Just as they began, a strong gust of wind swept through, disconnecting the piano wires they had painstakingly connected to the tree's large branch. Oh well, they redid it, and from there, the shoot was mostly improvised. Goldman utilized a number of experimental techniques, such as the dramatic and fantastical lighting, and sequences filmed in reverse, or with the camera running at a faster or slower than usual speed. They finished for the day, and planned to reconvene on February 7th to shoot film for the single's second A-side, Penny Lane.
Was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
The day before, the Beatles recorded the rhythm track for Sgt. Pepper's, and it was a very Paul-heavy recording, as he not only overdubbed the bass track, but also played rhythm guitar, a role usually occupied by John. This is a trend we will continue to see develop. While John's songs usually arrive to the studio a little less developed, and thus were more collaborative during the recording process, Paul almost always had the song fleshed out in his head, and so would often approach the recording process as a director, more than a collaborator. And while there is not necessarily anything wrong with this, Beatles fans will know that over time, this began to wear on the rest of the boys.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, whatever you want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it.
To be recorded on this day was Paul's lead vocal for the track.
They've been going in and out of style, but they're guaranteed to raise a smile.
And then the backing vocals. Mal Evans' diary entry from this day would read, recording voices on Captain Pepper, all 6 of us doing the chorus in the middle. So it appears that along with the trio of John, Paul, and George, that Ringo and studio staples Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall all contributed to the chorus's backing.
You're such a lovely audience, we'd like to take you home with us, we'd love to take you home.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head.
Part of what makes the Beatles' studio years so remarkable was how specifically they approached each aspect of the recording process. In their earlier years, everything was fairly boilerplate. Of course, it was wonderfully composed and arranged, thanks not only to the Beatles' talent, but the remarkable engineering prowess of George Martin. But the songs and sounds were simple, the recording process straightforward. Moving into Help and then Rubber Soul, there was a distinct shift in the guitar tones utilized by the boys. Influenced in no small way by groups like the Byrds.
The reason why, I can say.
Paul's Yesterday, of course, marked the first time that a Beatles arrangement was almost entirely orchestral. Norwegian Wood introduced an instrument to the Western world that would come to define the psychedelic period. Then we arrive at Revolver. There is no more obvious example than that of Tomorrow Never Knows, a song which shifted the popular music landscape significantly. But tracks like Eleanor Rigby and For No One sound almost of an entirely new genre. The guitar utilized throughout Revolver, with its extreme amount of treble, lends the whole album a unique, druggy feel. All of this amounts to my incredibly long-winded introduction to today's recording session. The first task of the day was re-recording Paul's lead vocal for the middle section of A Day in the Life. as Paul had decided that he wanted his voice to have a unique, sleepy-sounding quality, as recalled by Jeff Emerick. He explained that he wanted his voice to sound all muzzy, as if he had just woken up from a deep sleep and hadn't yet gotten his bearings, because that was what the lyric was trying to convey. My way of achieving that was to deliberately remove a lot of the treble from his voice and heavily compress it to make him sound muffled.
Found my way downstairs and drank a cup.
Found my way downstairs and drank a cup.
When the song goes into the next section, the dreamy section that John sings, the full fidelity is restored. Due to the limitations of the 4-track recording process, Paul's vocal was recorded onto the same track as John's vocal, making it incredibly important that Paul's vocal dropped out before cutting off any of John's. And the Beatles' newly appointed second engineer, Richard Lush, actually took the initiative to ensure this, speaking to Paul from the control room's talkback mic, stressing the importance of his vocal ending at just the right point. And if you listen closely, you can hear, ever so slightly, Paul rushing his last line.
And somebody spoke and I went into a dream.
Which brings us to our first mystery of the video, if you can call it that. There has been some debate as to who really sings the ahs leading into the next section of the song. On first listen, it is distinctly John, but some, myself included, hear several inflections throughout the vocal that sound far more Paul than John. If you take Jeff Emerick's word for it, the vocal is John's, case closed. That is what he recalls, and though memory is unreliable, he was incredibly involved in the recording process. But still, a seed of doubt lingers. In a Reddit, Ask Me Anything, with Paul McCartney from 4 years back, he himself recalled that. I seem to remember we all sang it, but I was definitely in there. We now returned our attention to the main section of the song. At that point, the rhythm still consisted solely of Ringo's maracas and just the slightest trace of George Harrison on bongos. Editor's note here. Prior studio notes indicate that it was Ringo on bongos and George on maracas. And John felt strongly that more was needed. Paul suggested that Ringo not just do his normal turn, but really cut loose on the track. And I could see that the drummer was quite reticent. Come on, Paul. You know how much I hate flashy drumming. But with John and Paul coaching and egging him on, he did an overdub that was nothing short of spectacular, featuring a whole series of quirky tom-tom fills. Emerick would take the lead in sculpting the drum's distinctive sound for the recording. We were looking for a thicker, more tonal quality, so I suggested that Ringo tune his toms really low, making the skins really slack, and I also added a lot of low end at the mixing console. This, combined with a number of creative miking choices on Ringo's drum set, are what resulted in one of the more remarkable percussive recordings on a Beatles song. And now, finally, we come to the point of inception, the idea that would turn the track into something wholly unique. That being the utilization of a symphony orchestra to fill the 24 bars that still remained empty before John and Paul's segments of the song. And from the jump, the Beatles knew that they wanted something beyond a typical arrangement. John had an idea, abstract as usual, about creating some kind of sound that would start out really tiny and then gradually expand to become huge and all-engulfing. What I'd like to hear is a tremendous build-up from nothing up to something absolutely like the end of the world. Picking up on the theme, Paul excitedly suggested employing a full symphony orchestra. George Martin liked the idea, but, mindful of the cost, was adamant that there was no way he could justify charging EMI for a full 90-piece orchestra just to play 24 bars of music. It was Ringo, of all people, who came up with the solution. Well then, he joked, let's just hire half an orchestra and have them play it twice. Everyone did a double take, stunned by the simplicity. Or was it simple-mindedness? You know, Ring, that's not a bad idea, Paul said. But still, boys, think of the cost. George Martin stammered. Lennon put an end to the discussion. "Right, Henry," his voice carrying the tone of an emperor issuing a decree. "Enough chit-chat, let's do it." It was decided. George Martin would book the orchestra for a session on the 10th. All that was left to figure out was exactly what sound they wanted to produce. We come to February 7th, and it was now time to film the promo for Penny Lane. With the single slated to release on the 11th, there was no time to waste. Goldman had dreamed up the idea of bringing in horses during his plane ride over. The end result was fantastic, although was easier said than done, as according to Goldman, the horses we got for the Penny Lane clip proved to be spirited, and when the Beatles got off them, they just bolted. It took us a couple of hours to recapture them from the far side of the park. Later in the day, the drummer of the Monkees, Mickey Dolenz, was invited to Paul McCartney's home. At this point in time, the Monkees were beginning to occupy the fanatical teeny bop niche the Beatles used to have a stranglehold upon, before they turned druggy, strange, and grew distasteful mustaches.
From everyone we meet. Hey, we're the Monkees.
It seems this may have been a little bit of guerrilla marketing for the Monkees themselves, and the meeting was possibly arranged by Don Short, who wrote the initial article detailing this meetup in the Daily Mirror. Avid Beatles fans will recognize Don as the journalist who accompanied the Beatles throughout their tours. And Don, as a friend, or at the very least, an acquaintance of Paul, could easily have phoned him and asked for the favor. Mickey would later say, "Paul is a beautiful guy. His mustache knocked me out. I may grow one like that someday." And he wore the most fantastic tie. Originally, the whole thing was a setup as a publicity thing, and although I didn't dig that idea, I was really pleased that it worked out so well, and that we seemed to get on well together. Paul would invite Mickey to attend the Beatles recording session scheduled for the next day. Unsurprisingly, John's "Good morning, good morning" was apparently inspired by an advertisement, that being a Kellogg's commercial that came on the television while he was writing.
Good morning, the best to you each morning. Sunshine breakfast, Kellogg's cornflakes, crisp and full of sun.
Maureen loves Kellogg's.
Good Morning is often considered one of the weaker tracks on Pepper, but personally, I really enjoy it. John very accurately captures that sense of day-to-day ennui and angst. It's not a sad song, but it's not a happy one either. It's frustrated. According to Paul, John was feeling trapped in suburbia, and he was going through some problems with Cynthia. It was about his boring life at the time. There's a reference in the lyrics to Meet the Wife. There was an afternoon TV soap called Meet the Wife that John watched. He was that bored. The Beatles recorded 8 takes of backing, with Paul, who intended on overdubbing the bass line later, assisted Ringo by playing his floor tom in the recordings. During the midst of all this was when Mickey Dolenz rolled into the studio. I thought it was going to be some kind of crazy Beatlemania fun fest.
We'll have to try.
Yeah, try and make it.
Much to Paul's chagrin, EMI Studios was booked up for the day, and while they would typically attempt to move heaven and earth to accommodate the Beatles, there was nothing that could be done on this day. But Paul was absolutely itching to begin recording on a track of his, so the Beatles would head into Regent Sound Studio. Paul must have had Fixing a Hole banging around since early January. As in last video, I brought up the fact that Paul had accidentally left a demo recording of the song at the end of the mysterious Lost Beatles recording, The Carnival of Light, that was played at the Million Volt Light and Sound Rave. Fixing a Hole is one of the songs that Mal Evans claims he contributed lyrics to. This could very well be the case, but I was unable to find any specifics on this. Based solely on the image and connotation that fixing a hole conjures, there was speculation as to whether this song was a heroin metaphor. But, as we all know, Paul's heart was wholly devoted to marijuana. While Paul does not bear the reputation of being a quote-unquote stoner musician, it is undeniably true that he absolutely adored pot. As he put it in his other ode to the drug, Got to Get You Into My Life.
Did I tell you I need you every single day of my life?
Just as Paul was about to leave to head to the recording session, a man walked up to his gate.
And the craziest story about it was the evening we were going to have the session. The session was booked, and I was getting ready to go out to the session, and a guy knocked on my door in London. And at that time I was living on my own, kind of with my bachelor pad in London, you know, so everyone always came around. It was the place to hang out. You could always come to Paul's. It was like any time of the night, you could always crash there. Anyway, this guy comes to the door, and I said, yeah, I didn't recognize him. I said, who are you? He said, I'm Jesus. So I just kind of looked at him, I said, well, you better come in then. You know, what are you going to do? So I got the kettle on. I said, you want a cup of tea? I thought, well, you know, got to treat him right. You never know, you know, you just... So it was fine, and I was chatting away, and he seemed like a great bloke and that. So I said, do you want to come to a session? He said, yeah. I said, you'll have to be very quiet and just sit in a corner, though. I said, I don't want to upset everyone, you know. And Lord knows what they're going to think, you know. So I went around, I just sort of said, this guy, he says he's Jesus, you know. I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances. Is it okay if he sits in the corner? So he sat there for the session on Fixing the Hole. We just made the record, said good night. I've never seen him since.
Paul knew exactly what he wanted for the song, and so it was banged out very quickly. George Martin accompanied them to the session, but Jeff Emmerich, contractually obligated to EMI Studios, was not able to. The rhythm track was incredibly simple, composed only of harpsichord, percussion, and bass. The bass was the driving force for the rhythm, so Paul played it with the band, rather than overdubbing. However, this did create a little quirk. Typically, Paul would play the keys on a track, as he had the most feel for the instrument compared to John or George. But seeing as he was playing bass here, good old talented and reliable George Martin would take over the harpsichord for this recording. The first take of the rhythm was satisfactory, so they then began overdubbing, which again was very simple. Paul recorded lead vocals, double tracking them.
I'm fixing a hole where the rain gets in and stops my mind from wandering where it will go.
With John joining Paul on backing harmonies. George would then overdub an excellent and very characteristically Harrison guitar solo to polish it off. In the days since the recording work on A Day in the Life on the 3rd of February, the Beatles had been in constant contact with George Martin, figuring out how to bring their concept of, quote, some kind of sound that would start out really tiny and then gradually expand to become huge and all-engulfing to fruition. For the Beatles, it was as simple as that. Book the orchestra, make it happen. I think it would be great if we ask each member of the orchestra to play randomly, Paul suggested. George Martin was aghast. Randomly? That will just sound like a cacophony. It's pointless. Okay, well then, not completely randomly, Paul replied. Maybe we could get each of them to do a slow climb from the lowest note their instrument can play up to the highest note. Yeah, interjected John, but George Martin was far more aware of the realities of working with professional session musicians. Come on, John, I said. There's no way you can get a symphony orchestra sitting around and say to them, look, fellers, this is what you're going to do. Because you won't get them to do what you want them to do. You've got to write something down for them. It was once again time for George Martin to demonstrate his brilliance and his ability to bring the Beatles' ideas to life. For the "I'd like to turn you on" bit, I used cellos and violas. I had them playing those two notes that echo John's voice. However, instead of fingering their instruments, which would produce crisp notes, I got them to slide their fingers up and down the frets, building in intensity until the start of the orchestral climax. That climax was something else again. What I did there was to write, at the beginning of the 24 bars, the lowest possible note for each of the instruments in the orchestra. At the end of the 24 bars, I wrote the highest note each instrument could reach that was near a chord of E major. The musicians also had instructions to slide as gracefully as possible between one note and the next. In the case of stringed instruments, that was a matter of sliding their fingers up the strings. With keyed instruments, like clarinet and oboe, they obviously had to move their fingers from key to key as they went up, but they were asked to lip the changes as much as possible too. Everyone was to start as quietly as possible, almost inaudibly, and end in a, metaphorically, lung-bursting tumult. And in addition to this extraordinary of musical gymnastics, I told them that they were to disobey the most fundamental rule of orchestra. They were not to listen to their neighbors. A well-schooled orchestra plays, ideally, like one man. Following the leader, I emphasized that this was exactly what they must not do. I told them, I want everyone to be individual. It's every man for himself. Don't listen to the fellow next to you. If he's a third away from you, and you think he's going too fast, let him go. Just do your own slide up, your own way. Needless to say, they were amazed. They had certainly never been told that before. It was going to be a huge day, but the Beatles, being the Beatles, decided that it should be even bigger. The following account was shared by Jeff Emmerich. A little later that evening, Paul had another brainstorm. Let's make the session more than just a session. Let's make it a happening. Lennon loved the idea. We'll invite all our friends, and everyone will have to come in fancy dress costume. George Martin smiled paternally. Well, I can certainly ask the orchestra to wear their tuxedos, though there may be an extra cost involved. Sod the cost, John said. We're making enough bloody money for EMI that they can spring for it. And for the party favors, too. To gales of laughter from the others, Lennon began reeling off a list of what he wanted Mal to purchase at the novelty store. Silly hats, rubber noses, clown wigs, bald head pates, gorilla paws, and lots of clip-on nipples. When the big day finally came, the session had indeed become a spectacle. Attending were Patty Harrison, Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, Keith Richards, Donovan, and a host of others. To get the orchestra in the mood for this very atypical day of work, the Beatles set about the studio handing out the silly props they had Mal purchase. When I went back into the studio, the sight was unbelievable. The orchestra leader, David McCallum, who used to be the leader of the Royal Philharmonic, was sitting there in a bright red false nose. He looked up at me through paper glasses. Eric Grunenberg, now a soloist and once leader of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, was playing happily away, his left hand perfectly normal on the strings of his violin, but his bow held in a giant gorilla's paw. The orchestra, of course, thought it was all a stupid giggle and a waste of money. But I think they were carried into the spirit of the party just because it was so ludicrous. Work began by allocating the Beatles' rhythm track onto one 4-track machine and setting up the orchestra to record on another, separate machine. Then it began. They recorded one go on a track, then they went again and recorded onto another track, until they filled all 4 tracks. Essentially, they had taken the effect the orchestra created and quadrupled it. All the while, the spectacle was filmed by Beatles publicist Tony Bramwell, with the idea to utilize the footage for a TV special. However, this never materialized, as the song would be banned by the BBC on release due to it containing drug references, which the Beatles would coyly deny.
We sort of said, I'd love to turn you on. And we looked at each other and think we know what we're doing here, don't we? We're actually saying for the first time ever, words like turn you on,
When the session musicians finished their work and left, the Beatles set right back to their work. They felt that the orchestral climax brought the song to too abrupt an ending. An idea was floated, a sustained hum of the final chord. Jeff Emmerich wrote that it was Paul's idea, while George Martin's recollection paints it as his. The song needed bringing sharply back down to earth. What we required, I thought, was a simple yet stunning chord, something very, very loud, very resonant. But what would give us that resonance? I had always thought that the sound of a lot of people chanting a mantra was impelling and hypnotic. Why don't we make a chord of people singing? Get them to sing all the basic notes and track them over and over and over again. The remaining guest gathered around a microphone and gave it several goes at humming and sustaining that final, powerful note. The effect, frankly, was somewhat pathetic.
A Day in the Life. This is take 8 and it's the choir for the end. Choir?
You lead it.
Come on, we'll all subconsciously
Follow my leader.
What's the note then, girl? Shall we just all check?
Eight.
Take 9.
As George Martin would later put it, if I had 4,000 people available to sing, it might have worked. Everyone in the building was dead tired. It had been a tremendous, exciting, and unbelievably expensive day of work, but it was worth it. The Beatles, their engineering team, and the orchestra had produced a sound like never before heard in a pop recording. On February 13th, the double A side of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane would be released, and perhaps the world wasn't quite ready for the new sound they presented. In Britain, it was the first Beatles single since Please Please Me in 1963 to fail to reach number 1 on the UK singles chart. The single was held, hilariously, at number 2 behind Engelbert Humperdinck's Release Me. But really, this was due to an asinine technicality, a chart protocol, whereby only the sales of the best-selling side of a double A side were eligible, and so the record's overall sales were effectively halved. In reality, the double A side sold considerably more than Humperdinck's Release Me. While the songs may have taken a moment to be processed by the public, there was one individual who was immediately shell-shocked. With the release of Rubber Soul in 1965, the Beatles secured their position as the most innovative group in pop music. But for the first time ever, in May of 1966, they were challenged, possibly even topped. The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds was a landmark achievement, a culmination of pop music's innovation in the period. Its impact on the Beatles helped drive their desire to once more up their game on Revolver, which, on Revolver's release, then drove the Beach Boys, specifically Brian Wilson, to innovate even more. They began work on their response, Smile, which was dreamed up to be a hybrid of their already established pop perfection and of the avant-garde. But due to issues with their record label, Capitol, and more so, Brian Wilson's perfectionism, the record continuously became stuck in the mud. When driving one day in February, listening to the radio, his body full of an array of substances, Brian Wilson heard it. Strawberry Fields Forever began to play. Brian pulled over his car and began to cry, lamenting to himself that the Beatles had, quote, got there first. On the same day as the single's release, the Beatles once more came into the studio. George Harrison was frustrated, spiritually, musically, financially. In September of 1966, he and Patty had flown to Bombay, an experience which was revelatory for George. He felt there what he had been missing back home. His heart was in India. He no longer desired to just be one of the boys. While George's talent as a songwriter undeniably continued to progress, at this time he was still not half the force of John and Paul. And while he still continued to contribute some very good tracks, for every one good one he brought in 2 or 3 that the Beatles and George Martin didn't consider up to snuff. That's not to say that John and Paul didn't perhaps overlook a song now and then. George apparently had written Isn't It a Pity back during Revolver, which is a beautiful track. Then we get to The Bread. The Beatles, financially, were not a monolith. The songwriting label of Lennon-McCartney dominated the Beatles' output, and thus, those two received the most money. To add to this, their songwriting contracts were separate entities. Lennon-McCartney received a larger percentage of royalties on their songwriting credits than George did for his. This was all distributed through their publishing contract with Northern Songs. So you probably now know where this is going. The song George arrived with today was titled Only a Northern Song. And no one, not John, certainly not George Martin or Jeff Emerick, not even George Harrison himself, was impressed with the track. Emerick would later say, his first attempt at contributing a song to the Sgt. Pepper album was a weak track that we all winced at, and it had minimal musical content that seemed to go nowhere. And to add to the misery, George Martin would recall the following. When George brought a new song along to me, even before he played it, I would say to myself, I wonder if it is going to be any better than the last one. It was in this light that I looked at the first number he brought for me for the Sgt. Pepper album. I groaned inside when I heard it. I had to tell George that as far as Pepper was concerned, I did not think his song would be good enough for what was shaping up as a really strong album. I suggested he come up with something a bit better. This tough love may have been needed. The next song George would bring forward would not be marginally, but significantly stronger, and one I consider to be one of the Beatles' most underrated.
Nothing to do to save his life, call his wife in.
Good Morning received just a couple of overdubs today, that being John's lead vocal,
Nothing to say but what a day, how's your boy been?
And Paul's bass line. On to the next day.
For the benefit of Mr. Kite, this is take 1.
If turning advertisements into music was an official job title, John would stand squarely at the top. But this time, it was not a TV or newspaper advert, but an antique poster from 1843, announcing that Pablo Fengke's Circus Royal was coming to town. And the circus would be for the benefit of a Mr. Kite, featuring Mr. J. Henderson. I wrote that as a pure poetic job. I had to write it because it was time to write, and I had to write it quick, because otherwise I wouldn't have been on the album. For the initial takes, John sang a guide vocal, Paul played bass, Ringo the drums, and George Harrison does not seem to have contributed. George Martin, however, once again stepped in to play the harmonium, and got his fair share of the instrument by the end of the session. I remember only too well pumping away with my feet at that bloody harmonium for hour after hour, trying to get it right, and being absolutely knackered, heart going at about 130 beats to the minute. It was like climbing up a steep flight of stairs non-stop. We would complete a take, I'd heave a sigh of relief, mop my sweaty brow, and then the dreaded call would come from John. I wouldn't mind doing that again. George, you all right there? The harmonium was a good idea, though, because it established a vaguely circusy atmosphere to the song straight off. After we laid down the 4 basic rhythm tracks, you can hear John saying, in an ironic voice,
I mean, it'll be on the bass.
Well, we'll have the Masked Alberts on by then, won't we?
The Masked Alberts were a bizarre and eccentric English comedy act, a duo I had recorded in the early days along with Spike Milligan. One of the Alberts played the trumpet rather badly, which is what John meant by his comment. It was time to add on the clever stuff, the brass.
Albert Records present the Morse Code Melody.
The session would end by overdubbing John's lead and backing vocals, with Paul and George joining.
The Hendersons will all be there, late of Pablo Frank is fair, what a scene. And tonight Mr. Kite is topping the bill.
It was a must that the instrumental of the song evoke the atmosphere of a fantastical circus. John, as usual, was full of creative ideas, but was having trouble expressing them in practical terms. "What I want," he explained earnestly to George Martin and me in the control room the next day, "is some kind of swirly music, you know?" George Martin didn't know. Lennon persisted. "I want the sound of a fairground around my voice. I want to be able to smell the sawdust and the animals. I want to feel like I'm at the circus with Mr. Kite and the Hendersons and all that." George Martin put in considerable effort to find an antique steam organ to bring into the studio, but to no avail. Jeff Emmerich suggested that they dig into the EMI sound effects archive instead. So the engineering team got to work pulling tapes. But the tapes were composed of short snatches of music, which in their current state would not be able to be dropped into the track for atmospheric purposes. So the engineering team got weird with it. They grabbed a few pairs of scissors and began cutting the tape into much smaller pieces. They would then throw all the little bits in the air to randomize them before picking them all up and putting them back together. It was in this way that they created that swirling, chaotic sound. The process was tedious, and the Beatles, for once, probably felt a little bit of what their engineers felt on a near daily basis. Emmerich recalls, "We were in Studio 3 that night because our usual haunt, Studio 2, was in use by another artist. As a result, the group's gear wasn't in the studio with them. It was still being stored in Studio 2, where we would be returning for most of the rest of the album. Because they couldn't play and jam, the four Beatles were getting impatient with how long it was taking us to assemble the sounds. They were out in the studio area amusing themselves as best they could, but they kept popping into the control room saying, 'Aren't you lot done yet?' At one point, John came in, and he was actually quite aggravated, but Paul calmed him down, saying, 'Look, it's a process, and it just takes a certain amount of time. You have to expect that.' But by the time the engineers were finished, the Beatles and John were absolutely thrilled with the results.
One, two, three.
The hummed ending to A Day in the Life had not met expectations. Something greater was still needed. And Paul, who creatively was firing on all cylinders, brought into the studio an idea inspired by something as simple as a sustain pedal. I'd noticed that with the piano. If you hold down a pedal on the piano, how long the chord lasts. I'd just do it like a party piece with friends. I'd say, 'Listen to this.' I brought the idea in. 'Hey man, it goes on forever. We should do this at the end of a song and just have it go on.' Time to get to work. George Harrison and Neil Aspinall weren't present at the session today, as according to George Martin, I assumed they were doing something together. Nobody seemed surprised at their absence. The others must have known in advance, but John was quite annoyed nonetheless. The first step of the process was to attain the massive sound that the Beatles desired, so the team dragged into the studio every single piano they had on hand. According to Emmerich, these were 2 Steinway grand pianos, another Steinway upright that was purposely kept a bit out of tune for a honky-tonk effect, and a blonde wood spinet. To get as strong an attack as possible, everyone decided to play standing up instead of sitting down. John, Mal, and George Martin each stood behind a different piano, while Ringo and Paul shared the out-of-tune Steinway upright. I presume they did double duty because Paul had to coach his drummer on which notes to play. Because there were 4 hands slamming out the chord instead of 2, that ended up being the dominant instrument on the recording. John was really out of it that night, so Paul repeatedly counted everyone in.
No, well, I won't say 4. Just imagine 4.
I was doing the other.
1, 2, 3.
It took quite a few takes to get a keeper because it was so problematic getting everyone to hit the start of the chord at exactly the same time. The next crucial piece of the puzzle was stretching the chord sustain as far as possible, and this would require far more than just depressing the pedal on the pianos. Let's hear again from Emmerich. Even if you hit a piano chord at full volume and hold down the sustain pedal, the sound only lasts for a minute or so before fading into nothingness. Compounding the problem was the fact that tape hiss and vinyl surface noise would obliterate any low-level signal all too soon. It seemed clear to me that the solution lay at keeping the sound at maximum volume for as long as possible, and I had two weapons that could accomplish this: a compressor, cranked up full, and the very faders themselves on the mixing console. Logically, if I set the gain of each input to maximum but started with the fader at its lowest point, I could then slowly raise the faders as the sound died away, thus compensating for the loss in volume. In effect, I could counteract the chord, getting softer, at least to some degree. In the end, they were so far up and the microphone so live that you could hear the air conditioning. It took 45 seconds to do, and we did it 3 or 4 times, building up a massive sound of piano after piano after piano, all doing the same thing. The chord was a fitting end to a day in the life. Shortly after the recording was completed, George Harrison finally showed up, accompanied by David Crosby of the Byrds. John ignored Crosby but couldn't resist hurling a little sarcasm at his bandmate. "Nice of you to turn up, George. You only missed the most important overdub we've ever done." With that, the day's work was complete. A Day in the Life was finished, a masterpiece composed of the entire band and team at their creative and technical best. The story will continue in part 4. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. If you want to see part 4 or all of the other videos I've done, please consider subscribing. Want to see more Beatles? I have a Patreon. For $1, you can watch videos early there, and for $2, you'll get exclusive content, including more casual podcast-type videos where me and my girlfriend, who is a new/first-time Beatles fan, listen and review the albums one by one from our differing perspectives. Any support you can give me on there helps me out so much.